"Please marry my sister, mister. We're starving." The words were a tiny, desperate gasp, barely audible above the city's indifferent hum, yet they cleaved through Arthur Vance's practiced indifference like a blade through silk. They were an accusation, a plea, a mirror held up to a world he tried not to see, a world he had meticulously constructed walls against, brick by agonizing brick. The ragged breath of the child, a whisper of hunger and bone-deep desperation, clung to the humid air of the alleyway, twisting around the scent of stale garbage and forgotten rain. Her eyes, wide and luminous in her gaunt face, were pools of unyielding hope and profound despair, fixed on him with an intensity that burned through the layers of his tailored suit and into the cold core of his being. She was a slip of a thing, no more than 10, her dress a patchwork of worn fabric, her small hand clutching a threadbare doll, its button eyes seeming to reflect the same silent anguish. He had stopped, drawn by some unseen tether, near the mouth of the narrow passage between two crumbling brick buildings, a place where shadows stretched long and thin, like the hunger gnawing at the city's belly. The afternoon sun, a weak, diluted gold, struggled to penetrate the smog-laden sky, casting a melancholic glow on the peeling paint and cracked windows of the tenements that loomed above them, silent witnesses to countless private tragedies. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a sensation he usually stifled with the quickening pace of his stride or the sharp snap of an order to one of his subordinates. But this child, this fragile, unwavering presence, had halted him in a way that no board meeting or market fluctuation ever could. Her words echoed, a stark, visceral reminder of a reality he constantly sought to outrun, a past he buried under layers of acquired wealth and careful disinterest. The raw immediacy of her plea stripped away his usual defenses, leaving him momentarily exposed to the biting wind of human suffering. Her gaze did not waver, a silent challenge in its innocent directness, demanding not pity but action. The weight of her unspoken story pressed down on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from scarcity and fear. He saw in her eyes not just her own hunger, but the spectral hunger of an entire family, a silent testament to the merciless grip of poverty that crushed lives in its iron fist, leaving behind only the hollow shells of despair. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The question hung in the air, a grotesque proposition that defied the very fabric of his ordered, solitary existence. He was Arthur Vance, a man who had clawed his way from the bottom, not one to be accosted by street urchins bearing such audacious demands. His life, he had always maintained, was meticulously curated, a fortress against the very kind of messy, desperate human entanglement that now stood before him, small and shivering. He looked away, his gaze sweeping over the grimy alley wall, noticing the faded graffiti, the ancient grime that seemed to ooze from the brickwork itself. He sought an escape, a logical reason to dismiss her, to walk on, to pretend this desperate plea had never pierced the thin membrane of his composure. Yet her image, a stark silhouette against the muted light, remained seared into his peripheral vision, an unwavering beacon of a suffering he preferred to keep at arm's length. The chill of the late afternoon air was not responsible for the goosebumps prickling his arms. It was the chilling realization that this child, with her simple, brutal honesty, had seen something in him, or perhaps merely sought someone, capable of an act of impossible generosity. He was not that man, he told himself, not anymore. The man who might have been moved by such a sight had been buried long ago, under layers of ambition and the bitter lessons of a cruel world. The man who stood here now was a survivor, hardened, cynical, and ruthlessly practical. But the child's unwavering stare, devoid of artifice, held a strange power, an inconvenient truth. It was a mirror reflecting a distorted image of himself, one he was loath to acknowledge. Her plea, simple yet profound, resonated with an old, forgotten ache within him, a memory of a different kind of hunger, a different kind of desperation he had once known, long before the tailored suits and the carefully constructed facade. He clenched his jaw, the muscles rippling beneath his skin. This was not charity. It was a transaction, a business proposition uttered by a child who understood the harsh currency of survival better than most adults. He had to decide in this moment whether to turn his back on a ghost of his own past, or to step, however reluctantly, into a narrative that promised only complication and an unsettling reflection of his own forgotten humanity. He heard the distant clang of a streetcar, the faint cries of newsboys, the rhythm of a city that moved on, oblivious to the small, agonizing drama unfolding in this forgotten corner, but he could not move. The child's silence now was more potent than her words, a heavy, expectant void that demanded a response, an acknowledgement of her desperate courage. The silence stretched, fraught with an unbearable tension, a silent challenge to the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. He felt the tremors of a profound discomfort ripple through him, an unfamiliar sensation that tightened his chest and blurred the edges of his meticulously ordered thoughts. He, Arthur Vance, a man accustomed to command, to the swift execution of his will, found himself paralyzed by the raw, unvarnished plea of a waif. His tailored suit, usually a second skin, suddenly felt stiff, constricting. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that did little to dispel the heavy silence that had fallen between them. "Your sister," he managed, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate against the weight of her suffering. His voice, usually firm and resonant, was brittle, betraying a flicker of the apprehension he felt. He was a man who dealt in facts and figures, not the heart-wrenching calculus of human desperation. The child nodded, a small, jerky movement, her large eyes still fixed on him, unwavering in their silent petition. Her name, she whispered, was Lily, and her sister Eleanor was beautiful, good, and starving, just like them. The mention of Eleanor's beauty, delivered with such innocent candor, struck a discordant note in Arthur's mind. It painted a picture of someone who, despite their dire circumstances, possessed a rare quality, a fragile dignity that hunger could not entirely erase. He imagined a face etched with the lines of privation, but still retaining a ghost of its former grace. This wasn't just a transaction for a piece of bread. It was a desperate offering of a life, a soul, in exchange for survival. He considered the implications, the sheer audacity of the request. A marriage not born of affection or aspiration, but of the brutal necessity of the stomach. It was an arrangement he had seen whispered about in the grimy corners of the city, a dark undercurrent of survival where human dignity was traded for sustenance. He had always dismissed such tales as the morbid fancies of the downtrodden, never imagining himself as a central figure in one of them. A bitter laugh almost escaped him, a sound he quickly swallowed. What a macabre jest this was, yet the child's eyes, devoid of any such cynicism, held only the raw, unblinking hope of someone who had exhausted all other avenues. They were the eyes of a creature cornered, fighting for the last scrap of light. He felt a strange pull, an unwelcome tug at the cold, hard shell he had built around himself. It was not compassion, not exactly. Perhaps it was curiosity, a morbid fascination with the depths of human despair, or a perverse challenge to his own hardened resolve. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain detached, to view the world through a lens of cold, calculating logic. But this child with her simple, devastating request had shattered that lens. He looked up beyond Lily, towards the entrance of the alleyway, as if expecting to see this elusive sister materialize, a living testament to the child's desperate plea. The sun, dipping lower, cast long, distorted shadows, making the alley seem even more desolate, a forgotten crevice in the sprawling, indifferent city. He thought of his own empty house, a cavernous space filled with expensive furniture and profound silence, a house that, despite its grandeur, felt more like a tomb than a home. And then, as if conjured by his thoughts, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows of the alley. She was tall, slender to the point of frailty, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each step required immense effort. Her dress, though clean, was simple, unadorned, the fabric clinging to a frame that spoke of deprivation. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back severely, was striking in its quiet beauty, even in the dim light. Her cheekbones were sharply defined, her lips pale, but her eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held a weary intelligence, a profound sadness that seemed to precede her, radiating outward like a silent lament. Eleanor. She moved with a dignity that defied her circumstances, a quiet strength that belied her emaciated form. Arthur felt an unexpected jolt, a flicker of something akin to recognition, though he knew he had never seen her before. It was the recognition of a shared burden, perhaps, or a kindred spirit in the landscape of human suffering. She looked at Lily first, a soft, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Then her gaze shifted to Arthur, meeting his without flinching. There was no shame in her eyes, only a bone-weary resignation, an acceptance of a fate she clearly considered inevitable. Her silence was a profound statement, more eloquent than any words. It was a silence that spoke of choices made under duress, of sacrifices offered on the altar of survival. She did not beg. She merely existed, a living embodiment of the child's desperate plea, a silent, profound accusation. Eleanor's gaze, unblinking and devoid of any overt emotion, held Arthur's, pulling him into a silent negotiation. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, reflected not a plea, but a deep, sorrowful understanding of the brutal transaction that hung between them. There was no shame, no pretense, only the stark reality of her existence. He felt an inexplicable ripple of unease, a sense that he was not the one holding all the cards in this macabre game. This woman, emaciated and clearly on the brink, possessed a quiet power that stemmed from her utter lack of artifice. She was a raw nerve, exposed, yet remarkably unyielding. He had expected tears, desperate entreaties, a performance of profound humility. Instead, he found a formidable resolve, a stoic acceptance that was both unnerving and, in a strange way, compelling. The air thickened with unspoken words, with the weight of implied histories. He was accustomed to people looking away from him, or looking at him with deference or avarice. Eleanor looked through him, as if seeing not just the man in the expensive suit, but the landscape of his soul, barren and scarred. He shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes creaking faintly on the grimy pavement. "Your sister, she speaks for you?" Arthur asked, his voice softer now, almost a murmur, the question feeling strangely redundant given Eleanor's silent, unwavering presence. Eleanor's lips, pale and dry, barely moved. "She speaks of what is necessary," she replied, her voice a low, husky whisper, like dry leaves rustling in a forgotten wind. There was a faint rasp to it, perhaps from lack of food or perhaps from long periods of disuse. It was a voice that held the echoes of past sorrows, a melody of quiet suffering. Her words were sparse, precise, carrying a weight that belied their simplicity. Necessary. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning, a stark testament to the desperation that had driven Lily to such an unthinkable act. It was a word that stripped away all romantic notions, all pretense of choice. It was a word that spoke of survival, pure and unadulterated. Arthur found himself mesmerized by her eyes, which held a universe of pain and an unyielding will. He saw a flicker of something in their depths, not fear, but a weary resilience, a quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of deprivation. He understood then that she was not asking for charity. She was offering a bargain, a final, agonizing gambit in a life that had offered her nothing but hardship. He looked around the alley, suddenly hyper-aware of the squalor, the broken windows, the lingering stench of decay. This was their world, a world he had long since escaped, but one that still clung to the edges of his memory like a persistent shadow. He remembered a time when hunger had been a constant companion, a dull, aching throb in his own belly, a time when choices were not made, but forced upon you by the cruel hand of circumstance. He thought of his own sister, long gone, swallowed by the same unforgiving streets, a memory he usually kept locked away in a forgotten chamber of his mind. The thought was a painful shard, twisting in an old wound. Could this be a chance for a different outcome, a different ending to a familiar tragedy? He shook his head imperceptibly, pushing the thought away. Sentimental nonsense. This was about survival, not redemption. He was not a savior. Yet the thought lingered, a nagging persistence, an inconvenient question in the silent chambers of his heart. The silence returned, more profound this time, broken only by the distant sounds of the city, a chaotic symphony that seemed to mock the stillness of their tableau. Eleanor did not press him, did not plead further. She merely stood, a statue carved from quiet despair, waiting. Her patience was a testament to her profound understanding of the situation, a silent acknowledgement that the decision, however agonizing, was now his to make. He could walk away. He could offer them a few coins, a meager sum that would only delay the inevitable. Or he could engage, step into the swirling vortex of their lives, and perhaps, in doing so, confront the very parts of himself he had so carefully buried. A bitter irony settled over him. He had built an empire on calculated risks, on shrewd decisions, on the ruthless pursuit of profit. And here he was, faced with the most illogical, emotionally charged proposition of his life. A proposition that promised no tangible gain, only an immeasurable, unspoken cost. The sun dipped lower, casting longer, more grotesque shadows, transforming the alley into a maw of deepening darkness. He finally spoke, his voice gruff, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Come to my office tomorrow. Early. We will discuss the terms." The words, sharp and clipped, hung in the frigid air between them, a fragile bridge built on desperation. Eleanor's eyes, which had held the weary calm of an ancient sea, flickered, a momentary tremor of something akin to surprise, then settled back into their customary stillness. Lily, however, gasped, a tiny, almost inaudible sound of pure relief, and instinctively moved closer to her sister, clutching her threadbare doll as if it were a talisman. Arthur watched the fleeting interplay between them, a brief, intimate tableau of familial love and shared burdens. He felt a peculiar mix of resentment and a strange, unfamiliar stirring within him. He was not a man who enjoyed being put on the spot, particularly not by a child, and certainly not in such a public, albeit forgotten alleyway. Yet there was a certain undeniable power in Eleanor's quiet acceptance, a dignity that seemed to demand a response, not out of pity, but out of a perverse sense of obligation to her unwavering resolve. He turned abruptly, his shoes crunching on the loose gravel, leaving them standing there, two fragile figures against the encroaching shadows. He did not look back. He could feel their gazes on him, Lily's innocent hope, Eleanor's profound and weary assessment burning into his back as he walked away, a silent indictment against the opulence of his tailored suit and the indifference of his stride. His mind, usually a well-ordered ledger of facts and figures, was a tumultuous sea of conflicting thoughts. The desperation of the child, the stoicism of the woman, the impossible request, it all swirled together, forming a vortex that threatened to pull him into a world he had meticulously avoided. He had left behind the squalor, the gnawing hunger, the constant suffocating fear of the streets. He had clawed his way out of the depths, not with charity, but with ruthless ambition and an iron will. He had seen too much, felt too much, lost too much in his youth. The memory of it, a raw, festering wound, lay buried beneath years of carefully constructed indifference. He had witnessed his own sister, Clara, succumb to the insidious grip of poverty, her laughter fading, her light dimming until it was extinguished entirely, leaving him with an indelible scar of guilt and helplessness. He remembered the desperate pleas he had made, the futile attempts to salvage what little hope they had. He remembered the cold, unyielding faces of those who could have helped, but chose not to. He had sworn then, in the bitter ashes of his grief, that he would never be that helpless boy again, and he would never be one of those cold, unfeeling faces. Yet as he walked away from the alley, he felt an unnerving chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the chill of hypocrisy, the unsettling realization that his carefully constructed fortress of indifference was now cracking, threatened by the very echoes of his own past. He arrived at his office building, a grand edifice of stone and polished brass, a stark contrast to the crumbling tenements he had just left. The doorman, a stiff, uniformed man named Jenkins, greeted him with his usual deferential nod. Arthur offered a curt acknowledgement, his mind still miles away, replaying the scene in the alley. He stepped into the silent, ornate elevator, the doors closing with a soft hiss, sealing him off from the world below. As the elevator ascended, a specific memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp, a fragment of a past he usually kept locked away. He was younger, perhaps 17, standing on a similar street corner, his stomach a hollow drum of hunger. His sister Clara, just a few years older, her eyes bright with fever and exhaustion, had coughed, a wet, rattling sound that still haunted his nights. He had been desperate, attempting to sell newspapers, his voice hoarse, his spirit flagging. A well-dressed man similar to his current self had walked past, his gaze sweeping over them with a dismissive air. Arthur had almost begged, the words forming on his tongue, but pride, or perhaps a nascent cynicism, had stopped him. He had watched the man disappear into the anonymity of the crowd, leaving them to their slow, agonizing descent. The memory was a searing brand, a reminder of the chasm that separated his past from his present. He had escaped, yes, but the escape had cost him something vital, something human. He had traded compassion for survival, empathy for ambition. Now, standing in the silent luxury of his office, looking out over the glittering city lights, the image of Eleanor and Lily lingered, haunting him. They were not just desperate souls. They were echoes of a forgotten self, a stark reflection of the boy he once was, before the world had hardened him into the man he had become. The city outside, a sprawling tapestry of light and shadow, seemed to pulse with 1,000 untold stories, and he, Arthur Vance, had just become unwillingly entangled in one of the most desperate. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that tomorrow morning would bring more than just a meeting. It would bring a confrontation with the very foundations of his own carefully constructed existence, a confrontation he was ill-prepared to face. The terms, he knew, would be far more complex than anything he could articulate. The morning arrived, cold and unforgiving, mirroring the apprehension that settled heavy in Arthur's gut. He had spent a restless night, haunted by the image of Eleanor's stoic face and Lily's desperate eyes. His office, usually a sanctuary of order and control, felt different, imbued with an unfamiliar tension. The antique grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, its measured cadence doing little to soothe his nerves. Precisely at the appointed time, a soft knock echoed through the silence of his inner sanctum. "Send them in, Jenkins," Arthur said, his voice betraying none of the internal turmoil. He adjusted his tie, a small, unconscious gesture of self-preservation. The door opened slowly, revealing Eleanor and Lily, silhouetted against the bright light of the outer office. Lily, despite the chill, wore the same threadbare dress, clutching her doll tightly. Eleanor, however, had made an effort, her dark hair neatly pinned, her simple dress clean and pressed, a testament to her quiet dignity even in destitution. She looked even more fragile in the harsh morning light, her face a canvas of exhaustion, yet her eyes retained that same unyielding quality, that profound and weary intelligence. "Mr. Vance," Eleanor said, her voice a little stronger than the day before, though still hushed, like a secret kept close. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, holding no hint of subservience or false humility. She carried herself with an understated grace that seemed utterly out of place in his opulent office, a stark contrast to the polished mahogany and expensive leather. Arthur gestured vaguely towards the two chairs opposite his desk, his hand feeling stiff, unnatural. "Please sit." He watched them settle, Lily perched on the edge of her seat, her small feet not quite touching the floor, Eleanor beside her, her posture erect, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. The silence that followed was thick, laden with unspoken expectations and the weight of their respective worlds colliding. Arthur found himself searching for words, an unusual predicament for a man accustomed to dominating conversations. He cleared his throat again. "So," he began, the sound harsh in the quiet room, "your sister, your proposition. I presume you understand what you are asking?" His gaze was fixed on Eleanor, probing, trying to gauge the depth of her understanding, the limits of her desperation. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "The proposition, as you call it, is for my family's survival, for my sister's survival." Her subtle correction, not her survival but her family's, was a quiet but powerful statement. It immediately shifted the narrative, framing her sacrifice not as an act of personal desperation, but as an unwavering commitment to those she loved. It was a testament to her selflessness, a stark contrast to his own self-serving existence. Arthur felt a ripple of irritation. He preferred to deal with individuals, with clear-cut motivations, not with the messy entanglements of family duty and sacrifice. He prided himself on his ability to see through pretense, but Eleanor's honesty, her quiet resolve, was disarming. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled. "And what do you expect in return?" he asked, his voice sharper now, a challenge. He wanted to strip away any remaining illusion, any lingering hope that this would be a gentle arrangement. He wanted her to articulate the price, to name the cost, so he could quantify it, weigh it against his own perceived inconvenience. Eleanor's eyes, however, did not betray a flicker of surprise or offense. She seemed to have anticipated his question, to have already calculated the grim ledger of her future. A roof over our heads, food, warmth. A future for Lily, she stated, her words measured, each one a stone laid carefully in place. "And your protection, Mr. Vance, from a world that has shown us little mercy." Her last phrase, "your protection," resonated with an unexpected power, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of those who had nothing. It was not a demand, but a quiet, desperate plea for a haven, a shield against the relentless onslaught of a cruel existence. Arthur found himself studying her, truly studying her for the first time. He saw the faint purple shadows beneath her eyes, the chapped skin on her hands, the almost imperceptible tremor in her lips when she paused. But he also saw a strength, an unyielding core that had somehow survived the crushing weight of destitution. She was not broken. She was merely worn. A memory flickered, unbidden, from his youth. A time when he had desperately sought protection, a shield against the cold indifference of the world. He had found none. He had fought, clawed, and built his own. Was this his chance to be that shield for someone else? The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He, the hardened survivor, now faced with the role of a reluctant savior. The silence descended once more, heavy and fraught, filled with the unspoken terms of this strange, desperate contract. The silence that followed Eleanor's quiet articulation of terms was a vast, echoing cavern in Arthur's meticulously ordered office. He found himself studying her, truly studying her. Beyond the initial shock of her presence, he noticed the fine, almost invisible lines of worry etched around her eyes, the subtle tremor in her clasped hands, betraying a fragility she worked tirelessly to conceal. Yet beneath the surface of exhaustion, he sensed an unyielding strength, a resilience forged in the crucible of hardship. She was not a cowering supplicant. She was a woman making a desperate, calculated choice, a sacrifice born of profound love for her sister. This realization, stark and unvarnished, gnawed at him. He had expected a transaction of desperation, a simple exchange of her dignity for his resources. He hadn't anticipated the quiet weight of her resolve, the unwavering focus on Lily's future that permeated her every word and gesture. It was a stark contrast to his own life, a solitary pursuit of wealth and power, devoid of such selfless attachments. A chill, unrelated to the morning air, seeped into his bones. He recalled a time, long ago, when his own world had collapsed, when his sister Clara's fever had raged, and he, a boy, had stood helpless. He had pleaded then, silently, desperately, for someone, anyone, to offer them a lifeline, a shield against the inevitable. No one had. He had watched Clara fade, her small hands growing cold, leaving him with a raw, gaping wound of regret and a profound distrust of human kindness. That day had hardened him, forged him into the man he was, self-sufficient, ruthless, and deeply cynical. He had sworn never to be that helpless boy again, never to rely on the unreliable mercy of others, and perhaps more crucially, never to allow himself to feel that agonizing powerlessness again. Now, looking at Eleanor, a ghost of Clara's desperate spirit seemed to shimmer in the room. Was this an opportunity to rewrite a painful past, or merely to entangle himself in a new, equally complicated tragedy? He pushed the thought away, dismissing it as sentimental folly. This was not about redemption. It was about pragmatism. He had the means. They had the need. A simple equation. Yet the emotional weight of their presence made it anything but simple. "And what?" Arthur asked, his voice rough, cutting through the silence. "Do you offer in return for my protection?" He wanted to hear her say it, to articulate the true cost, to strip away the veneer of noble sacrifice and lay bare the uncomfortable terms of their bargain. He needed to hear the words from her, to confirm the brutal reality of the situation. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "My presence," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with a strange, unyielding resolve. "My companionship, the keeping of a house, loyalty, discretion." Each word was delivered with a solemn finality, a careful enumeration of services, as if she were detailing her credentials for a position. She listed them not as a woman selling herself, but as a person offering an exchange of labor and silent understanding for the very right to exist, to nurture her fragile sibling. She paused, her eyes searching his, as if to gauge his reaction, to determine if her offerings were sufficient. "And, of course," she continued, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper, though the words carried clearly in the stillness of the room, "the promise that Lily will never know the hunger we have known, that she will have the chance to be a child, not a survivor." This last statement, delivered with a quiet intensity, struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. It was not a negotiation. It was a plea from a soul so weary, so burdened, that it was willing to surrender everything for the sake of another. The implications of my presence and companionship were clear, unspoken, yet palpable in the heavy air between them. He knew what she was offering, and it was far more than mere household duties. He felt a profound sense of discomfort, a clash between the hardened pragmatist he was and the faint, almost forgotten echoes of the man he might have been. The silence that followed was charged with the unspoken, the uncomfortable truth of their arrangement. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, a pattern of ornate plasterwork he usually ignored. He considered the sheer audacity of it, the unexpected turn his life had taken. A child's plea, a sister's sacrifice, and he, Arthur Vance, the architect of his own solitary empire, caught in the undertow of their desperate struggle. He lowered his gaze, meeting Eleanor's once more. Her face was a mask of stoic resolve, but in the depths of her eyes, he thought he glimpsed a flicker of something else, a fleeting sorrow, a private grief that had nothing to do with her present circumstances, an open loop, a new mystery to unravel in the grim tapestry of her existence. He knew with a certainty that chilled him that agreeing to this would be more than just a transaction. It would be an irreversible step into a narrative far more complex and emotionally demanding than any business deal he had ever brokered. The terms, however clearly articulated, felt profoundly insufficient to define the true cost of their desperate bargain. The bargain, stark and unadorned, was struck not with a handshake, but with a silent, heavy nod from Arthur. It felt less like a mutual agreement, and more like a surrender to an unforeseen current that had swept him into its relentless flow. Eleanor responded with an equally subtle inclination of her head, her face remaining a mask of composed weariness, betraying neither triumph nor relief. Lily, however, unable to contain her childlike hope, offered a small, tentative smile that cracked the strained atmosphere, a fragile bloom in a barren landscape. Arthur felt a fleeting pang, a sensation he quickly suppressed. This was not about sentimentality. This was a practical arrangement, however unconventional, to address a pressing, immediate need. He instructed Jenkins to prepare suitable living quarters within his sprawling, largely empty mansion, ensuring they were comfortable, but not ostentatious. He also arranged for a small regular stipend for Eleanor, ostensibly for household necessities, but understanding its true purpose was to provide for the family's basic needs, a discreet lifeline. The transition was swift, almost clinical. Within days, Eleanor and Lily were settled in a quiet wing of Arthur's imposing residence. The vastness of the house, usually a source of quiet pride for Arthur, now felt cavernous, its silence punctuated by the soft sounds of Lily's play, the rustle of Eleanor's movements. It was a peculiar coexistence, a forced intimacy in a house that had always been a fortress against intrusion. Eleanor moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, tending to the rooms, ensuring Lily was fed, bathed, and comfortable. She was unobtrusive, almost spectral, her presence marked more by the absence of disarray than by any overt action. She never overstepped, never intruded upon Arthur's routines, maintaining a respectful distance that underscored the unusual nature of their relationship. Yet Arthur found himself increasingly aware of her. He would catch glimpses of her in the hallways, a fleeting shadow at the periphery of his vision. He would hear Lily's soft laughter, a sound that resonated strangely in the usually silent house, and know Eleanor was near, tending to her sister. Their meals, taken separately at first, slowly began to converge, a tacit acknowledgement of their shared space. He would sit in his study, the rich scent of leather and old books filling the air, and find his thoughts drifting to the other wing of the house, to the quiet woman and the hopeful child. He knew their arrangement was a facade, a marriage in name only, designed to provide the bare necessities of survival. But the constant proximity, the shared air, began to erode the carefully constructed barriers he had erected around his heart. He observed Eleanor's interactions with Lily, the gentle touch, the soft murmur of comfort, the quiet strength she drew upon to shield her sister from the harsh realities they had escaped. He saw the profound love that bound them, a bond that resonated with an old, forgotten ache within him, a longing for the familial warmth he had lost so long ago. The house, once a monument to his solitary ambition, now housed the fragile echoes of a family, a stark reminder of the life he had chosen to leave behind. He found himself watching Eleanor more closely, seeking clues to the woman beneath the stoic facade. Her eyes, often downcast, would occasionally lift, meeting his with a quiet intensity that held a curious blend of gratitude and a subtle, unreadable sorrow. There was a story in those eyes, a history of pain and resilience that he couldn't quite decipher, a mystery he felt an unwelcome urge to solve. He would find her sometimes late at night, sitting by a window, gazing out into the dark, her silhouette framed against the moonlit garden. She would be utterly still, her thoughts miles away, perhaps replaying the memories of a life that had brought her to this desperate bargain. He felt a strange pull, a reluctant curiosity about the burdens she carried, the silent sorrows that shaped her quiet resolve. The silence between them, once a sign of awkwardness, began to transform, becoming a shared space of unspoken understanding. Their conversations were still sparse, functional, revolving around the mundane aspects of household management or Lily's well-being. But beneath the surface, a subtle current flowed, a growing awareness of each other's presence, a silent acknowledgement of the profound and peculiar bond that now linked their fates. The arrangement, initially a cold calculation of survival, was slowly, subtly, beginning to take on a life of its own, weaving itself into the fabric of their days, irrevocably altering the carefully ordered world Arthur had so meticulously constructed. The facade, once so clearly defined, began to blur at the edges, hinting at deeper, more complex truths beneath its carefully maintained surface. The quiet, almost invisible threads of their shared existence began to weave a new tapestry within Arthur's house. Eleanor, with her unassuming presence, possessed a peculiar power, not through overt acts, but through her sheer unyielding resilience. Arthur, in his moments of solitary reflection, would find his thoughts drifting to her, observing her from a distance, trying to decipher the unread chapters of her life. He saw the way she handled Lily, with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, a fierce protectiveness that spoke volumes about her love for her sister. He noticed the quiet hum of a lullaby she would sometimes sing, a melancholic tune that echoed through the house, carrying the unspoken grief of a forgotten past. This quiet grace, this understated strength, began to erode the edges of Arthur's cynicism, stirring a discomfort he struggled to name. He was a man who preferred predictable outcomes, quantifiable results. Eleanor, however, was an enigma, her depths unfathomable. One evening, he found her in the library, a room he rarely used, her head bent over a worn, leather-bound book. The light from the single lamp cast a soft glow on her face, illuminating the sharp planes of her cheekbones, the elegant curve of her neck. She did not startle when he entered, merely acknowledged him with a quiet nod, her eyes returning to the page. "You read?" he asked, the question abrupt, betraying his surprise. He had assumed her life, defined by hardship, would have offered little room for such luxuries. "When I can," she replied, her voice soft, almost a whisper, as if hesitant to break the stillness of the room. "It offers escape." Her gaze lifted then, meeting his, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a glimmer of something beyond the weariness, a longing, a quiet yearning for a world beyond her reach. It was a rare glimpse into the private landscape of her soul, a landscape he realized was far richer and more complex than he had ever imagined. The conversation, brief and superficial, left an indelible mark. It chipped away at the stereotypical image he had constructed of her, replacing it with something far more nuanced, more human. He found himself increasingly intrigued by these small revelations, these glimpses into her inner world. He noticed her subtle acts of defiance, not against him, but against the crushing weight of her circumstances. The way she would mend Lily's clothes with painstaking care, transforming rags into garments of quiet dignity. The way she would find beauty in discarded objects, a fallen leaf, a broken shard of pottery, arranging them with an artist's eye. These were small acts of creation in a world that sought to destroy. One afternoon, he overheard fragments of a conversation between Eleanor and Lily, their voices low and muffled from the garden. Lily was asking about their past, about a papa and a mama she barely remembered. Eleanor's responses were vague, evasive, yet imbued with a profound sadness. "Some things," Eleanor murmured, her voice laced with an unspoken grief, "are best left to the shadows." Her words were punctuated by a long, heavy silence, a silence that spoke volumes about the pain she carried, the secrets she guarded. Arthur felt a jolt of recognition, a chilling resonance with his own carefully guarded past. He knew the weight of unspoken sorrows, the corrosive power of memories best left to the shadows. He felt a sudden, unwelcome connection to her, a shared burden of historical grief. A new mystery presented itself, shrouded in the quiet pain of Eleanor's past. Who was this papa? What had happened to them? The open loop, previously about the nature of their marriage, now twisted, expanding to encompass the hidden history of the woman who shared his house, and in a strange way, his life. He found himself wanting to know, not out of idle curiosity, but from a burgeoning, almost reluctant need to understand the source of her quiet sorrow, the depths of the burdens she carried. The carefully maintained facade of their arrangement, a simple transaction for survival, was slowly but irrevocably dissolving, revealing layers of human complexity beneath. The house, once a symbol of his solitary ambition, was becoming a stage for a slow, unfolding drama, a poignant exploration of shared histories and the enduring power of silent suffering. The quiet woman, Eleanor, was no longer just a figure of necessity. She was becoming a compelling presence, a silent challenge to the very foundation of his carefully constructed, emotionally barren existence. The silence that often permeated Arthur's grand house was no longer empty. It was filled with the subtle hum of Eleanor's presence, the faint echo of her movements, the distant sound of Lily's quiet play. Arthur found himself increasingly aware of these sounds, of the subtle shift in the atmosphere of his home. The mystery surrounding Eleanor, sparked by her evasive comments about her past, began to gnaw at him with an insistent, almost unbearable persistence. He found himself observing her with a renewed intensity, searching for clues, for any hint of the shadows she guarded so fiercely. He noticed her flinch sometimes, at a sudden loud noise or a sharp movement, a flicker of fear in her eyes that was quickly masked. It hinted at a history of trauma, a past more violent than he had initially imagined. One blustery afternoon, a sudden torrential downpour trapped them both indoors. Arthur was in his study, attempting to focus on ledgers, when he heard a faint crash from the parlor. He rose, a flicker of annoyance, and walked to investigate. He found Eleanor standing amidst the shattered remnants of a porcelain vase, an antique piece he had acquired years ago. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling, not from fear of his anger, but from something deeper, more primal. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, seemed to be staring through him, at a memory only she could see. I apologize, Mr. Vance," she stammered, her voice thin, barely audible. "It slipped. A sudden noise. I don't know." Her explanation trailed off, lost in a quiet gasp, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He saw the cold sweat on her brow, the pallor of her skin. It was more than clumsiness. It was a visceral reaction, a deep-seated terror triggered by something unseen. "It's fine," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, softening despite himself. He knelt, picking up a shard of porcelain, its sharp edge a mirror to the fractured landscape of her mind. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" The question, simple and direct, seemed to pierce through the veil of her terror. She blinked, her gaze slowly focusing on him, and a flicker of something akin to gratitude, mixed with profound vulnerability, crossed her features. "Yes," she whispered, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. "Just a moment. A memory." She didn't elaborate, but the unspoken hung heavy between them. A memory of what? A crash, a sudden noise, a moment of profound fear. He didn't press her. He knew the corrosive power of such memories, the way they ambushed you when you least expected it, leaving you breathless and exposed. He had his own, buried deep, but never truly gone. Later that evening, unable to shake the image of her terror, he found himself drawn to the library again. He found Eleanor there, not reading, but staring blankly at the unlit fireplace, her hands clutching a small, tarnished silver locket. He recognized it. Lily often wore it around her neck. This time Eleanor was not stoic. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the dim light. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, holding a quiet sorrow. "My mother's," she said, her voice barely a whisper, indicating the locket. "And Papa's. They are all I have left of them." She opened the locket, revealing two faded daguerreotypes, a stern-faced woman and a kind-eyed man, her parents. "They were taken during the riots," she continued, her voice catching raw with unshed grief. "They were trying to protect us, to get us out. But the crowd, the police, it was chaos." Her words, hesitant at first, gained a painful momentum, like a dam slowly cracking under immense pressure. "I was with them. Lily was too young to remember. We were separated. I hid her, hid myself. But they didn't make it." The truth, delivered in fragments, fell between them like shattered glass. The riots, the unspoken societal conflicts, the chaos that had ripped families apart, the desperate struggle of marginalized communities fighting for basic rights against overwhelming odds. This was the backdrop of her life, the crucible in which her resilience had been forged, and the source of her profound, abiding sorrow. Arthur felt a chilling recognition. He had heard about those riots, had read about them in the newspapers, abstract accounts of unrest and violence. But now, seeing the raw pain in Eleanor's eyes, hearing her fragmented narrative, the abstract became horrifyingly concrete. It was not just a historical event. It was the searing truth of her personal tragedy, the source of her fear, her silent suffering. He looked at the locket, then back at her. The stereotypical societal conflicts mentioned in his Jason profile were no longer abstract. They were the very real, very human cost of injustice, the brutal reality that had orphaned Eleanor and Lily, forcing them into a life of desperate choices. He understood now the true depth of her strength, the quiet dignity that masked such profound and enduring grief. The open loops of her past were closing, revealing a narrative of loss and survival that resonated deeply with his own long-buried pains. Their marriage, a desperate bargain, now felt less like a transaction and more like a fragile alliance forged in the shared understanding of trauma, a quiet acknowledgement of the brutal world they both, in different ways, had been forced to navigate. The weight of Eleanor's revealed past settled heavily in the quiet house, a new, somber presence that colored their every interaction. The truth about her parents' violent deaths during the riots was a brutal, visceral reality, a stark testament to the systemic violence and societal conflicts that had shaped her life. Arthur found himself seeing her anew, not just as the quiet, stoic woman who tended his home, but as a survivor of a profound, devastating loss, a truth that resonated deeply with his own buried grief. The barrier between them, meticulously constructed from the artifice of their arrangement, began to crumble, revealing a raw, shared humanity. He saw the flicker of that raw terror in her eyes whenever a sudden noise echoed through the house or a distant siren wailed. He understood now the true source of her quiet dignity, the profound strength that had allowed her to carry such a devastating burden and still nurture Lily with unwavering love. Their conversations, once clipped and transactional, began to evolve. stretching into longer, more personal exchanges, though still cautious, laden with the weight of unspoken experiences. He would find himself discussing his day with her, not seeking advice, but simply sharing, a need for connection he hadn't realized he possessed. She, in turn, would listen, her eyes attentive, occasionally offering a quiet, insightful remark that demonstrated a sharp mind despite her lack of formal education. One blustery evening, a storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil that had begun to stir within Arthur. The power flickered, then died, plunging the house into darkness. Eleanor, surprisingly, was not frightened. She moved with a quiet competence, lighting oil lamps and candles, her silhouette flickering against the walls. Lily, initially scared, clung to her sister, but Eleanor's calm presence soon soothed her. Arthur watched them, two figures bathed in the soft, dancing light, and felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, a strange sense of belonging in this unexpected family. He saw the stark contrast between his solitary, often cold life and the quiet, resilient warmth that Eleanor brought into his home. The house, once a silent monument to his achievements, now felt alive, infused with the gentle rhythm of their lives. He thought of Clara, his own lost sister, and the bitter loneliness that had plagued him since her death. He had built his empire as a shield against that loneliness, but it had only intensified it, leaving him isolated in his wealth. Eleanor, through no design of her own, had somehow breached that fortress. He found himself drawn to her, not with desire, but with a complex mix of reverence and a burgeoning protective instinct. He saw the weary lines around her eyes, the subtle curve of her mouth that hinted at an occasional fleeting smile, the quiet strength in her hands as she calmed Lily. He began to see her not as a means to an end, but as a person, profoundly scarred, but remarkably whole. He started to recall more fragments of his own past, memories he had meticulously suppressed, the desperation in his own eyes as a boy, the same look he had seen in Lily's, the crushing helplessness he felt as Clara faded. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that the societal forces that had taken Eleanor's parents were not so different from those that had consumed his own sister. Poverty, indifference, a world that crushed the vulnerable. The irony of his position now was not lost on him. He, a man of means, had been offered a forced marriage as a desperate solution to survival, just as he himself had once been on the brink of such a desperate existence. The climax, he sensed, was not an external event, but an internal reckoning, a slow-burn revelation of his own flawed humanity. The facade of their marriage was not just about survival. It was about confronting the ghosts of his own past, about acknowledging the raw, bleeding wounds of a world he had tried to escape. He looked at Eleanor, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, her face serene despite the storm outside. He knew that the true terms of their bargain had nothing to do with money or physical comfort. They had everything to do with a shared understanding of suffering, a quiet acknowledgement of the indelible marks left by a cruel world. The question now was not whether he would fulfill his promise to her, but whether he could allow himself to feel, to truly connect, to dismantle the walls he had built around his own heart. The storm raged outside, but within the quiet confines of the house, a different kind of turmoil was brewing, a slow, agonizing unraveling of a lifetime of carefully constructed emotional detachment. The pivotal emotional climax was approaching, not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent ache of understanding, a deep, unsettling resonance between two souls bound by shared histories of loss and quiet resilience. The quiet, persistent ache of understanding permeated the very fabric of Arthur's days. Eleanor's story had not merely informed him, it had irrevocably altered the landscape of his inner world, shattering the carefully constructed walls of his emotional detachment. He found himself increasingly preoccupied by her unspoken sorrows, by the quiet dignity she maintained, despite the crushing weight of her past. He saw her now through a different lens, not as a transaction, but as a mirror reflecting the very parts of himself he had long denied. The parallels between her trauma and his own, particularly the loss of his sister Clara, were too stark to ignore, too painful to compartmentalize. This shared history of loss, of fighting against an indifferent world, created an undeniable, profound connection between them, a bond far stronger than any formal agreement. One crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived, bearing the official seal of the city's housing authority. It was a formal notice, demanding the immediate demolition of the old tenements where Eleanor and Lily had once lived, citing structural instability and blight. The news, though expected by many, struck Arthur with a strange personal resonance. He imagined the other families, displaced, scattered to the winds, their meager belongings bundled into pathetic remnants of lives uprooted. He watched Eleanor as he told her face paling, her eyes clouding with a distant pain. It wasn't just the destruction of a building, it was the eradication of a past, a tangible link to a life that, however impoverished, was still her own. A quiet grief settled over her, a profound sense of loss for the collective suffering of those who had been left behind. She spoke then, her voice a low, haunted whisper, of the families she knew, of the children who would now be truly homeless, their already tenuous existences shattered. "They have nowhere to go, Mr. Vance," she murmured, her gaze fixed on a distant point, as if seeing the faces of the dispossessed. "Nowhere but the streets. They will starve." Her words, simple yet profound, struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He thought of Lily, safe and warm in his house, and the stark, brutal reality that but for the desperate plea, she would be among them. And then he thought of Clara, her fragile body succumbing to the cold indifference of those very streets. The memory was a searing brand, twisting in an old, unhealed wound. He looked at Eleanor, her face etched with a quiet despair that mirrored his own buried helplessness. It was then, in that shared moment of quiet desperation, that the pivotal emotional climax arrived, not with a dramatic pronouncement, but with a raw, undeniable recognition of their shared vulnerability, their shared humanity. His carefully constructed facade of detachment crumbled, revealing the raw, bleeding truth beneath. He saw in Eleanor not just a woman to be protected, but a profound connection to his own lost self, a chance to reconcile with the boy he had been, helpless and grieving. He saw the irony, the brutal truth of his own morally ambiguous existence. He had profited, gained power, sometimes at the expense of others, always with an eye toward self-preservation. But this woman, this fragile, resilient being, was willing to sacrifice everything for others, for her family, for a sense of human dignity that transcended mere survival. A fierce, protective instinct surged within him, stronger than any he had ever known. It was not pity. It was something far deeper, far more complex. It was a recognition of a shared wound, a profound empathy born of similar experiences, a desperate desire to protect the innocent from the relentless cruelty of the world that had claimed so much from both of them. He reached across the polished desk, his hand hovering, then covering hers, a gesture entirely uncharacteristic for a man who rarely touched another. Her skin was cool, but not cold, and she did not pull away. His gaze met hers, and in that moment all pretense, all ambiguity dissolved. He saw the shock in her eyes, then a slow, dawning comprehension, a recognition of the raw, exposed truth of his own heart. "No," he said, his voice thick, rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Not if I can help it, not anymore." His words were not just about the families from the tenements. They were a vow to himself, a promise to the ghost of Clara, a silent declaration of war against the indifference that had shaped his life. It was a confession, a silent plea for forgiveness, and a desperate, hopeful step towards a different future, a path that was not paved with solitary ambition, but with the fragile, tentative hope of human connection and shared redemption. The weight of his own moral ambiguity, the burden of his past actions pressed down on him. Yet, in that moment, in the warmth of her hand beneath his, he felt a flicker of something new, something profoundly hopeful. The tremor in Arthur's voice, the uncharacteristic touch of his hand spoke volumes, shattering the last vestiges of pretense between them. Eleanor's gaze, initially startled, softened as she met his, a silent acknowledgement of the raw, exposed vulnerability in his eyes. In that shared moment, the full weight of their intertwined histories, of loss, desperation, and unexpected connection, converged. It was a profound, unspoken communion, a testament to the fragile yet potent bond that had silently formed between them. The external world, with its demolition notices and societal indifference, faded into a distant hum. All that remained was the quiet intensity of their shared understanding, a profound resonance between two souls scarred by the world, but finding an unexpected solace in each other's presence. The immediate aftermath was not marked by grand declarations or dramatic shifts. Instead, it was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of their daily lives. The silence in the house, once heavy with unspoken words, now felt companionable, infused with a new understanding. Their conversations, no longer confined to household matters, ventured into deeper territory, exploring shared memories, fragmented dreams, and the quiet fears they both carried. Arthur found himself listening more, speaking less, allowing Eleanor's quiet strength to fill the spaces he had always guarded so fiercely. He noticed her subtle smiles, the rare moments of genuine lightness that flickered across her features, and felt a quiet satisfaction he had never known. Lily, sensing the shift, bloomed in the house, her laughter becoming more frequent, her small presence a constant reminder of the fragile hope they were building together. Arthur, in turn, began to shed the layers of his hardened cynicism. He visited the demolition site not with the cold calculation of a businessman, but with the quiet understanding of a man who had walked those very streets. He spoke to the displaced families, offered assistance not as charity, but as a shared burden, a small attempt to mend the fractured fabric of a community. He recognized the irony of his transformation. The man who had once feared entanglement now actively seeking connection. He started to funnel resources, discreetly at first, then more openly, towards initiatives that supported the displaced, providing food, shelter, and opportunities for work. His actions were not altruistic in the conventional sense. They were born of a deep personal understanding of suffering, a profound need to confront the ghosts of his own past. The resolution of their marriage was not a conventional happy ending, but a quiet, hopeful beginning. It was not a tale of romantic love blossoming from desperation, but of two scarred souls finding a profound human connection, a shared purpose in a world that often felt devoid of meaning. The initial bargain, a grim contract of survival, had evolved into a fragile yet enduring partnership. Eleanor remained in his house, not as a wife in the traditional sense, but as a trusted companion, a quiet confidant, and the gentle anchor of a nascent family. Their relationship was defined by respect, by a shared history of pain, and by a mutual, unspoken commitment to Lily's future. The moral ambiguity of their initial arrangement faded, replaced by a quiet dignity, a testament to the transformative power of empathy and shared experience. Arthur, though still a man of business, carried a new lightness, a quiet humanity that had been buried for years. He was still flawed, still complex, but the hard edges of his cynicism had softened, replaced by a nuanced understanding of the human condition. He had found, in the most unexpected of places, a connection that transcended wealth and status, a bond forged in the crucible of shared suffering and quiet resilience. He had learned that true wealth lay not in the accumulation of material possessions, but in the fragile, precious connections forged through empathy and understanding. The narrative resolved itself not with a grand flourish, but with a quiet, reflective peace. The city outside continued its relentless hum, a backdrop to countless other untold stories of desperation and hope. But within Arthur's house, a small, fragile light burned, a testament to the possibility of redemption, of finding meaning and connection in the most desolate of circumstances. It was a story of survival, yes, but more profoundly, it was a story of human connection, of finding a quiet, enduring hope amidst the shadows, a testament to the power of a plea from a little black girl, long ago, in a forgotten alleyway.